Okay, we left off talking about the birth of the Monroe Doctrine and the fact that Spain was slowly but surely losing its colonies in Central and South America, and that with these revolution or independent countries, while they really wanted to be as strong as the United States, they couldn't because they lacked the education, they lacked the financial means, and therefore they were in a constant cycle of revolution and takeover, and very easy for another government to come in and conquer. And Monroe began to see a pattern. He had found out that the Russians were moving outside of Alaska, where they had already claimed for itself. They were moving outside of Alaska through British Columbia and down through Washington and Oregon. And they were trying to lay claim to that land as their own. And then you had France, who was looking at these small Latin American countries going, we could reestablish ourselves in the Americas if we take over these countries. So Monroe really wanted to keep European influence whatsoever out of the Americas. Now, Britain did come to him, and they wanted to issue a statement together to provide a unified front, and it might have looked like a good idea. Hey, you have the world power, Great Britain, wanting to stand with you to make this statement, but Monroe wanted it to be uniquely American. He did not want to have it look like the only reason why they were making the statement was because they had British backup. They wanted to stand on their own and say, you know what, we're going to say, if you come over here, we're going to take action. So the statement he made against the European encroachment was called the Monroe Doctrine. And in this Monroe Doctrine, he said, no more European colonies in America. You're going to leave Americas alone. You're going to let them establish themselves as they need to, and you're not going to have any more influence on the Americas. The governments of the Americas were different from the European governments because you still had monarchies in Europe. And in the Americas, United States going down to Mexico and all of these smaller Latin countries were trying to be republics. So they were not going to have kings and queens. They were going to have presidents, and they were going to have, prime ministers. They weren't going to have the same type of government as Europe. So they needed to stay separate from Europe because of just that one difference. The U.S. promised not to interfere in European affairs. And like I said, this was going to piggyback off of what Washington had done at the beginning, and that was the proclamation of neutrality. The United States was not going to stick its nose in European affairs, and as long as Europe did not stick their nose in American affairs. And that meant all of the American nations that sat on these continents. It also said that any future attempt by Europe to colonize would receive an act of aggression. Oops, I misspelled aggression, so let's correct that. Would be seen as an act of aggression by the United States, which means that if we looked at it as aggressive, then we were going to send our military to handle the situation. And the Monroe Doctrine laid its foundation for U.S. foreign policy. I'm sorry, I'm stumbling over my words. While Washington's proclamation of neutrality gave birth to the idea of isolationism, the Monroe Doctrine gave it the teeth. We basically said we are not going to get involved in outside skirmishes as long as U.S. interests and U.S. lives are not at stake. When U.S. lives and interests are compromised because of fights going on around the world, well, then we will send our soldiers to fight those battles. So, this is a very important doctrine. It's a doctrine we are going to follow all the way up until World War I. Technically, we also abide by it in World War II. The war is going on for several years before we actually get involved in World War II. And the only reason why our military gets involved is because of Pearl Harbor and the attack of the Japanese. And once that happened, all gloves were off, and we went ahead and not only fought the Japanese, but went in and fought the Germans. After World War II, we no longer hold to the Monroe Doctrine, in that we are no longer isolationists, and then we end up working on a global scale with the United Nations, and we end up being their watchdog whenever there's human rights violations. All right, so now we have capital letter C, domestic affairs for James Monroe. The economy. The War of 1812 had created a large demand for raw materials. Remember, we had the embargo. We had to turn and look to ourselves to provide goods that were being denied to us because of governmental action. So after the war, the market was flooded and the prices of raw materials dropped. So now you had everybody providing these raw materials, and all of a sudden where, let's say some wood would have cost you maybe $1 a board, that's just an example. Now, because everybody's providing wood, you're having wood being sold at 50 cents a board. And the problem with that, obviously, is that if people can't make money, then they can't pay their bills and everyone goes into debt. We're kind of seeing this right now. We're seeing the reverse of it. Right now, we're in the middle of an energy crisis. There's been the European hackers that have messed with a gas company here in the United States. I'm going to move this up. And, you know, because they've messed with it, this gas company has turned off its gas production. Now we have states in the South who are in an energy crisis. They can't get gas. People are trying to sell gas for about $100 a gallon from what I've understood. And so this is what happens when there is a crisis, and it also causes a panic. So how do we rectify this? Well, we had high gas prices during the Obama administration. During the Trump administration, we actually saw a flush of gas hit our system. So then all of a sudden the price went down, and it went down to about $2.50 a gallon, which was acceptable, $2.25 maybe a gallon. That was all within everybody. That made, you know, the consumer happy. The regular American citizen was happy with that. The idea behind Trump's doing this was basically to take us away from being dependent on foreign oil. If we were always dependent on foreign oil, then the foreign nations, especially those who were controlled by Al-Qaeda, they could control how much they sold the oil to us for, and then that would affect our gas prices. So by Trump flooding the market with gas, it dropped gas, and all of a sudden, now we were no longer dependent on foreign oil. So this is kind of the same thing that happens here. People turn to themselves to make the raw materials. Now everybody's making, everybody's growing corn, everybody's growing rice. They're all going to the trees for lumber. They're all fishing, and they're not relying on foreign nations to provide these things. And so now the prices go down drastically low, and people are unable to make the money they need to pay their bills. State banks began to issue banknotes without gold or silver backing. I've talked to you about this before, where back then you should be able to go to the bank and give them $1 and say, I want $1 worth of gold, and the bank had to be able to give it to you. It's what we call the gold standard. There was actually precious metal or wealth backing the piece of paper that we were using to pay for something, so that when someone took that banknote, they could go to the bank and they could get $1 worth of gold or $1 worth of silver. I've told you before that Franklin D. Roosevelt will eventually take us off the gold standard, so that now we don't have anything backing our money. Our money is as only good as our economy is. So when the stocks and the bonds and the trading on Wall Street is good, well then our dollar value on the world market, that's what they call the Dow, is great. But when those factors are not going in our favor, then the dollar value goes down. So now we don't know how much our money is worth because it changes on a daily basis. You might open the market with a strong dollar, and then by the end of the day, the dollar may have reached the lowest it's reached in 25 years. You just never know. Some of you have all seen Coach's investment in Dogecoin, and you know that he likes to watch it, and you watch that number on his phone when he wants to talk about his how much, if the Dogecoin stock gets up to a certain point, how much money he's going to make. But he might start the day at Dogecoin being worth 50 cents, but by the end of the day, Dogecoin might be 35 cents, in which case he's lost some of the money he thought he made. I hope this kind of makes sense to understand why it was really bad that these banknotes were being issued without gold or silver backing, and they were unable to pay their loans to the National Bank. So everybody was in the midst of a financial crisis, and it became known as the Panic of 1819. And so once again, the Supreme Court is going to step in with a landmark case called McCulloch versus Maryland. So in this case, state governments who had disliked the National Bank, they would actually tax the National Bank for their services. And specifically, the state of Maryland was trying to force the Baltimore branch of the National Bank to print money on paper bought from Maryland, and the president of that branch, his name was James McCulloch, refused. So basically, Maryland was saying, you can't print any national money unless you use money bought from our state, and then they wanted to tax him on it at like a sales tax, and James McCulloch refused. And so it came to an impasse, and it went before the Supreme Court. And John Marshall, still the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he says that states can't tax the federal government, so therefore what Maryland was demanding was unlawful, and that the National Bank was a constitutionally permitted entity under the Necessary and Proper Clause, and the Constitution received its power directly from the people and the state. So basically what he's saying to Maryland, hey, you approved this Necessary and Proper Clause. You said the federal government was able to take whatever position it needed to take. It could do whatever it needed to do in order that they found to be necessary and proper. So therefore, underneath the Necessary and Proper Clause, the National Bank was as strong of an entity as the Supreme Court. It was a constitutionally created entity underneath the Necessary and Proper Clause, and therefore they could not take that back. And so by doing that, state governments could not interfere in constitutionally supported activities of the federal government. Another landmark case that came out of this was Gibbons versus Ogden, and this laid the precedent. Remember, we had judicial review coming out of Marbury versus Madison that laid the basis for judicial review, where the Supreme Court could declare a federal law unconstitutional. Well, Gibbons versus Ogden, now John Marshall lays the precedent for state laws being declared unconstitutional. And underneath this case, you have John Marshall upheld the Congress's right to regulate interstate commerce. Okay, the last thing that on the domestic front was slavery. It was becoming the largest domestic issue. Everybody was beginning to have stronger and stronger opinions about it. There was heated arguments, and there was a real push for change. Now it was not only just a moral issue that we had to confront, it was now a political and economic issue. The southern states were so strongly enmeshed in slavery, they were so dependent on slavery that they could not change. I'll pick this up in my last video.